I want to address a recent New York Times opinion piece by Nicolas Kristof regarding Costco's rotisserie chicken that goes for $4.99 a bird and the animal rights allegations made against Costco. See, what he omits in his article, in his good article, is America's attitude towards food. He talks about animal suffering, and that's good. We need to be considering that. But ultimately, all this is a result of America's particular culture around food. This is a culture that is obsessed with food. There's food at every event. We do a lot around food, but we don't actually take time for food. So food is considered fuel, and fuel, we know, should be cheap. Okay, so I want to tell you two stories in relation to this. Costco was a longtime customer of mine as I sold fish to the American public for many years. We farmed fish, and Costco was one of the few customers that really cared about how we farmed and how we produced. And I don't think it was just to avoid a Greenpeace blimp hanging over their door accusing them of things, right? Like they're facing now with the chickens. I had a hard time explaining to the American consumer otherwise why our fish was more expensive than the ostensible equivalent out of China. So we paid our people well, we did things environmentally correctly, we cared about animal welfare and all that, and that comes at a cost. But Americans don't seem to want to associate how food is produced with the end cost. And the Costco example is actually really interesting because it is impossible to farm chicken and then to get it out the door, out of the rotisserie, for $4.99 a bird. In fact, when I was telling this, that Costco was selling these birds, when I was telling this to an international colleague, he completely dismissed me as having the numbers wrong, and he said, it's impossible. And I said, no, what is impossible is to sell a rotisserie chicken for $12 or more to the American consumer. They want things cheap. Now, just to be clear, Costco is not actually producing these chickens for $4.99 a bird. They're actually losing money on that particular bird, but it acts as a draw into the store, right? People go to Costco for that great juicy chicken, and then they'll end up buying everything else. So in a sense, Costco is cross-subsidizing. Costco brought chicken farming in-house, which is highly unusual for a retailer to do, in order to be able to control costs. But they're never going to reach that because even other producers had to admit we can't do it at that cheap. That doesn't mean that it's bad farming at Costco and the others are okay. In fact, chicken farming since the 30s has been hell-bent on producing faster growing, bigger birds and not really thinking about animal welfare. This is not something new. What is new is that maybe Americans start to ask themselves why chicken costs what it does, but this is the crux of the matter. Americans need to rethink what food should cost and why it costs what it does. And that actually requires Americans to sit down and to relate to food in a new way, whether it's around the dining table, to actually sit down and enjoy good quality food together. And the other thing that Americans have to ask themselves is some of these preconceived notions that they have, are they actually true? Having been a fish farmer, I would often get these horror looks when I tell people that I farm fish, because to the American consumer, all farmed fish is bad and farmed fish is unhealthy and fish farmers are about as popular as human traffickers. These kind of judgments might make the American consumer feel really smart and great. It's not. Another thing I want the American to think about is when you talk about Beyond Meat and buying these meat substitutes, as if that's ecologically better. You have to think about the monocrops that feed into this. You have to think about the costs there, about the environmental implications when we no longer have animals grazing and converting grasses into high-value protein. Again, it might feel good to point fingers at Costco or to make superficial judgments about one type of production over another, but it's dishonest. And so I encourage the American to slow down and to actually get educated, because food nourishes us. We are dependent on food, and it does matter how our food is produced. There was a time where we worshiped the industrialization of food, and now we're realizing what it did to our soils. In the same way, there's a time now where we are quickly passing judgment for or against some production method, But it ultimately comes down to you, the consumer, voting with your dollar. And your dollar does matter. Your dollar can shift an entire industry because it's your dollar along with many, 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 many other people. And if you gather with your friends and family and think about these things and care to do it right, entire industries will shift.